Okay, this is my 11-minute practice run for um, for the Intemerate Earth presentation. Hello, Kako. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion on post-growth. In these 10 minutes, I hope to leave you with some tangible optimism by introducing you to Intemerate accounting from a Pacific perspective. Restoring our ecological biodiversity, reversing climate change, and redistributing global wealth are the three biggest issues challenging ecological and economic justice. Intemerate accounting is a post-growth initiative that could provide the systemic sea change necessary to address this crisis in global governance. It is apparent that we are on the brink of global catastrophe and that the structures and choices expressed in our present economic system valorizes rather than punishes ecocide, wealth and health disparities, and perpetuates the kind of exclusionary practices that invokes this doomsday outlook. It is also apparent that the crises that we are faced with is an existential conundrum. Peace achieved through war is a moral hypocrisy. How can we take pledges of good climate policy seriously if our leaders continue to provoke military incursions with the most reckless abandon? Demilitarization, deoccupation, and decolonization, we cannot address post-growth if we continue to reproduce these very conditions that enable hegemony. So, having gotten that out of the way, I will demonstrate in this outline that Intemerate accounting is an achievable post-growth campaign addressing the issues of environmental sustainability, well-being, and global governance. If our objective is to reduce fragility factors, we must focus on growing factors that promote economic and ecological justice, like restoration, revitalization, and redistribution. Therefore, we must begin with another kind of accounting methodology that redefines and requantifies growth using indicators that developing countries and impacted peoples require. Intemerate Earth is our campaign to transition our national, regional, and global accounting system. This was initially developed in collaboration with the Pacific Conference of Churches and the Pacific Theological College, which last year culminated in the publication of a book called Ecological Economic Accounts Towards Intemerate Values. While I initially conceived of this as something that could be promoted through the ACP countries, it really was geared towards a program for Pacific regionalism to address factors that kept the Pacific tethered to the colonial, post-colonial neoliberal system. Then, in 2020, when the COVID pandemic happened, it didn't take long to realize that this had the potential for being more than a Pacific or an ACP construct. The world demanded change. Our little accounting paradigm could really be an explosive, radical seed for global ecological and economic transformation. Now, while there are many alternative indicators being discussed right now and new ways for accounting for GDP, what makes the Intemerate accounting equation unique is that it does not simply adjust national accounts by adding new environmental indicators. If all we are doing is adding new green or blue indicators, we will not be addressing the issue of redistributing wealth or moving away from the privatization or neoliberal framework. In fact, I would argue that new indicators could simply impose another top-down consent for an eco-neoliberal economy, where the same power structures will be providing security, technology, monitoring, auditing, etc., perpetuating the current system of exploitation and exclusion that we should be moving away from. Intemerate accounting is completely different. Firstly, we've created a more just way of measuring baselines. Secondly, we include a factor that allows for a relatively seamless transition away from the dominant GDP-based national accounting system towards one where well-being indicators can modify our national accounts. And thirdly, we are inclusive of real-world market strategies that can make this financially viable for developing countries and underserved communities. Typically, economic baselines are the starting point or the base from which to measure growth. Baselines are used to measure gains and losses. All indicators that measure growth use baselines as a starting point. The unique thing that the intermerit baseline does is that it inverts the starting point to be the goal and captures the incremental data against the time axis towards restoration. In the Pixar movie Soul that came out last year, the main character, after he transitions, has to wait in that long line to get into heaven, and then realizes that to get in, he has to reunite with his soul to repair his merit. We are in that kind of logic. We need to reunite with our baselines and engage in an economy of reparation. This inversion is a kind of systemic reparation that we need to break out of this cyclical terror of history. It is a better reflection for measuring environmental and social indicators as it values people's interactions rather than treating everything as a commodity. This inversion is represented in our equation with n representing the factor being restored. You can apply this to almost any environmental condition and record quantifiable data to meet the real world conditions for auditors and regulators. And while I know this sounds like a very bold assertion, I would put it to the test in real world terms. To make a claim that there is a tangible equation that can be used to restore our ecological biodiversity, reverse climate change, and redistribute global wealth sounds like hyperbole or snake oil or some magic fountain of youth. But it is not. This is simply a mathematical formula that can be tested through input-output tables, measuring our interactions over time, calculating the rate by which restoration and rehabilitation can occur in quantifiable and relatively predictable terms. So rather than a top-down commodity-driven approach where environmental values are leveraged against carbon offsets, for example, the intermerit baseline is a bottom-up approach where environmental values are determined by the interactions of local communities. What could be better than local, indigenous, or customary processes developing and benefiting from their own services and technologies to meet their targets and goals on their timeline? Imagine that by inverting the baseline, there could be a verifiable way to quantify our ecological interactions and essentially own our data and protecting the inherent wealth of environmental health and well-being factored. So we have mapped a curriculum that outlines the micro and macro coordination needed to implement and grow this framework. But what we lack is a kind of on-the-ground institutional support that our interfaith councils offer and the ability to communicate this story to their communities. Organizationally, we have developed some tools like the intermerit characters, the manifesto, and the curriculum, but we simply need more engagement with institutional governance. When we consider the accounting standards checklist for ESG or environmental and social governance, we're talking about a reporting format focusing on corporate governance around non-financial measurements for environmental sustainability and social impacts. ESG has not yet been standardized or quantified, which I would say is one of the objective goals in the current international climate and SDG meetings. And so the question remains, how do we quantify what is inherently unquantifiable? Methods and standards need to be worked out, and the only solution that seems to be on the table is the worst one of all, the privatization and valuation of our resources based on commodity scarcity. So very briefly, I just want to say that Wall Street has recently created a commodity investment sector on water trades based on California water prices. It's these kinds of utilities that appear to check off the environmental sustainability box in ESG reporting, but it does so at the expense of people and their rights to access. So I cannot help but wonder if much of the military base building near aquifers or the licenses given to industries that contaminate our groundwater inflates the commodity scarcity pricing of water. And if it does, what does that do to how we are able to access water? As a bulwark to this kind of degradation and depletion, we could treat the intermerit equation as a financial index, like a stock index, but rather than it being managed by Wall Street, an intermerit index can be managed by the very same communities that are doing the work. This is particularly relevant as the IUCN recognizes the central and essential role of indigenous communities in stewardship and conservation of biodiversity. There is a high potential for creating new financial markets based on the measurement of our interactions rather than on the valuation of commodities, shifting the demand from extraction towards one that values service. This data belongs to indigenous and customary rights holders, stakeholders, not Wall Street fund managers. This kind of data access could provide the triple benefits of sustainable livelihoods, decentralized local ownership, and democratic participation. We aim to enable these kinds of conditions. We all have the opportunity to measure, to count, to examine, to protect, to nurture, to analyze, to collect, to describe, to compile, to publish, to monitor and manage our environments. This is a service that is certainly much older than capitalist and privatization regimes, and our local economies should benefit from these interactions. What the intemperate baseline does is serve as a kind of verifiable guideline for regulators and auditors to mark the rate of restoration to see whether communities are indeed attaining the goals they have set for themselves. In light of the promise of optimism I mentioned in my introduction, I would like to respond to the ask and call to action that is inscribed in the timeline and end with a request. If intemperate accounting complements and catalyzes other initiatives to produce the post-growth and post-colonial future that we want and deserve, then can we raise this math over the specter of our current global governance? Mahalo, and thank you.